So, Dr. Kraemer, when you look at the structure of periodization, one of the key components is obviously to make as much optimal gains as possible spread over, these blocks of time. And one of the biggest goals is recovery, and you want to, avoid overtraining as much as possible. But how do you differ overtraining versus under recovering, and can, periodization really limit or decrease this? How does that work?
Well, first of all, we're going to talk later, probably, because a little beyond this question, there's so many different periodization models out there. And I think for the most part, one of the hallmarks of periodization, in theory, has been that we're trying to eliminate really a type of what we call overtraining. Now, historically, we've looked at a lot of parts of this. But true overtraining is something very dramatic and very long term. So when we think of overtraining, that means you could have a catastrophic effect on the career, on years, if it's something truly that is going to cause what people call overtraining in a syndrome. And there's been a lot of discussion on that. I think the terminology that are coming out more recently is in the last 10 years is the fact we talk about overreaching, and then whether it's non-functional overreaching or functional overreaching. Now, Dr. Michael Stone has done a lot of work in this area of periodization and weightlifting, one of the icons in the field. And basically, he'll talk about the fact if you successfully know how to use it, you can use functional overreaching to try and get super compensation. But you got to know what you're doing. And that's a key factor in a lot of these type of programs. If you aren't intimately understanding what you're doing, then you can have this decrease in performance that in fact can last longer than you want and not necessarily be as quickly to super compensate. So we really look at the fact that non-functional overreaching is really when, remember the acute program variables we just talked about, you haven't accounted for something. And all of a sudden that factor is coming in and you can't figure out why you're not making progress in a particular targeted goal. And with that, you end up making no progress, you plateau, or you might go down. And a lot of times this comes back to the fact that there is a great need for monitoring and accounting every workout. And that's one of the things I think that you have to be very clear on, is that if you monitor and account for what's going on in the workouts, what's going on in the other aspects of what we call disruptors, then basically you can really see if in fact you're running into really a non-functional overreaching phenomenon where in fact something's going on that you don't understand. And it could come from many sources. It could come from poor sleep. It can come from poor nutrition. It can come from many different sources that really relates to the fact that your progress is being inhibited. And I think, again, that relates to the fact that we want to try and optimize the quality of the workouts and the quality of recovery. And there's many factors that go into recovery technologies now. There are many different interventions and ways to approach recovery and what people think about. And, that is one of the aspects as well. So typically when you talk about underloading, well, again, it comes to longitudinal monitoring. If you have a targeted goal for strength improvement, which is one variable, and you're not making any improvement, it obviously goes back to the acute program variables of are you doing the type of lifting exposures you need with heavier weights to gain strength. And typically what we see is undercutting something may come because in a particular program, it's not utilized because people are afraid to lift heavy, for example. They're not training at the proper intensity. Many times this happens in the world of different sports where the mythology of the sport has never really accepted, heavy lifting, for example, in a particular sport that may then be causing no progress in strength. And then that has ramifications on the physiological status of tendons, density of tendons and ligaments and muscle, etc. So I think when we look at the different aspects of periodization, we have to realize that many different models exist. There is a host of need for individualization for both the individual and the sport. There's basically targeted goals. There's some fundamental bases that need to be covered. And basically, you have to understand that at times the overreaching is non-functional because something's going on that you don't understand. And you have to go back and assess this and have a good assessment program and individual monitoring. So I think from that standpoint, periodization is only as good as the monitoring that goes along with it to see if your targeted goals are being met. If they're not, you got to go back to the design of the program and what's going on, what's there, not there, what you don't know that's there, and basically then adjust it. So in fact, you optimize it for that particular block of time in your training program to optimize what the target is. So that's really what it comes down to.
I think that's important because I don't know if a lot of people, truly understood the difference between overtraining and overreaching. And I think people like to say the word overtraining, whereas there's a pretty high possibility that they're not actually overtraining, that they could be overreaching. But I never thought, your average gym goer is going to be, overtraining to the point where it's going to have some catastrophic delay in their training for months and years, whereas they could be potentially overreaching. And that's why they're, hitting these certain plateaus, but they're not looking at their program because, they're not tracking their data. They're not writing down their workouts and their RPEs for the lifts. So you're never really going to know if you don't have that, data right in front of your face.
Well, one of the things that really is important, Dr. Fry, Andrew Fry at the University of Kansas, he is a former doctoral fellow of mine when I was at Penn State. He's at the University of Kansas running a great program in sports performance, sports science, resistance training, one of the top ones, I think, in the United States. And basically what he found in our early research, we found, for example, that we did an intentional overreaching program, and we wanted to mess up the 1RM of these lifters, doing 10 1RM squats a day for like 14 days with only 1 day partial rest. And we found out that it was only 73% of the individuals actually lost their strength. It's a nice study that was published quite some time ago. But what it showed you is 27% of the population were able to tolerate it. And so that showed us the individualization of really even high intensity overreaching. We knew what we were doing. So we could be classified as actual functional overreaching. But in this case, we were trying to see what happens. We were the first to really say, let's see if we can intentionally do this and what happens physiologically. And we learned a lot from that series of research. And he went on to do a lot of other type of work in that area. So I think it's really an interesting phenomenon. And overtraining, again, is the dichotomy of the organizations in Europe and the United States. They've come up with what they think are the definitions of those type of things. That's kind of what I've talked about here in the last